First, I want to thank all of you for sticking around, first of all. And I want you to know that the panelists that are going to be out here joining me in just a minute are fully aware of the responsibilities we have and the heavy burden we carry. This panel has to be good because we understand that we're the only thing standing between you and happy hour. And so we're going to do our very, very best to make it worth your while to stay around for this last hour, and we appreciate you doing that. We've got a great panel, and if you're wondering exactly what I'm going to do, I've got a very short presentation here to make, but also I'm killing a little time while they're getting mic'd in the back because we got one set of mics and the panel that just came off is got to take those mics off and put them on. Since I don't sing, I don't dance, and I didn't bring any vacation photos with me from last summer, I'm going to do a quick presentation, some of it a little recap, some of the things you've heard already today, but then also hopefully put a little different spin on this whole issue of transportation finance. And the first is starting out with a presentation this morning that Dr. Christensen did in terms of looking at the growth in population and registered vehicles and miles traveled in Texas, as well as the supply of roadways. You see what's happened in the last decade in Texas. Huge growth in population, vehicles, vehicle miles traveled. In other words, a lot of growth on the demand side, not anywhere near as much growth on the supply side. So, you know, I look at, as an economist, I tend to look at things in supply-demand terms, and you get that mismatch for a long period of time, you end up with the problems that we have. And it's not a recent phenomenon, it goes back 40 and 50 years. And so that's where we are right now in terms of the issues that we have to address. How do we begin to close this gap? And that's what this panel is going to talk about today, particularly from the financing side. So much so that you've heard the 2030 committee referenced several times today. If you look at one of the things that they found is that the infrastructure needs in Texas over the course of the next 25 years likely to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $270 billion. Now, I don't know if that's exactly right or not, and I'll be long retired before we find out. But it's a big number. We do know that. But we also know that there is a price associated with saying no. No is not free. And in fact, the economic cost of not addressing that issue, of letting the system continue to deteriorate, both in terms of its condition and in terms of its performance, is significant. And it's about $1 trillion. So there is a cost to say no. There is a cost to do nothing. And that's something that is often not really appreciated. But without getting into any numbers, I want to show you a little graph here that I wasn't smart enough to develop, but somebody in our office was, and it illustrates the point, I think, quite well. What really happens when our transportation infrastructure deteriorates over time, both in terms of its capacity and its ability to handle this increase in traffic. If you think about it from a labor market point of view, if you think about it from a consumer market point of view, over time, let's just say that red line there, that you worked where that black dot is. And so, or rather you were an employer and you employed people where that black dot was. And about in terms of your employees, about the most reasonable commute that you can expect your employees to make is about an hour. Now maybe it's an hour, 15 minutes, maybe it's 45 minutes, that's immaterial. Let's just say it's an hour. But that's your labor pool, all right? Those are the potential employees you have that you can attract to operate, to work at your business, that have the skills that you require. What happens over time as congestion gets worse? Well, your labor pool shrinks, okay? So what do you do? And if you remember, by the way, your pies and your R's and your squares from high school, you remember, you can recognize this math, you've lost right there about 75% of your labor pool that now lives outside of an hour commute. How do you incentivize them to work for you? Well, you have to pay them more, generally speaking, in order to get them to make that commute. What does that do? Well, that drives the price of your product or service up. It makes you less competitive if you include that price, that cost in your final price. And if you don't, then you have to take that cost to the bottom line, which affects your profitability, which is income, if you have a sole proprietorship or a partnership or shareholders. and their dividends. It's income to them. It's income to somebody. It is a cost to somebody now because of traffic congestion. It has a real impact. Let's take it at another scale. Let's say you just own a dry cleaners, okay? Employ 2 or 3 people. And everybody within a 10-minute drive of your dry cleaners is a potential client, potential customer, if you will. What happens when traffic gets worse? Well, your customer base shrinks. And now they're about 25% of the market area that you once had. You lost 75% of it. You didn't do anything. You're just operating your business as profitably as you can possibly operate it. But traffic congestion got worse, and for those people now, it's longer than a 10-minute commute, and they find somewhere else to go take their dry cleaning. And you end up having to lay somebody off. Somebody loses their job because of it, not because of the way you operated your business, not because you did a bad job cleaning clothes, but because traffic got worse. Those are the economic consequences that we don't often think about. But they are real, and they make a difference over time. It's the same way, if you will, if you're a parent, okay? And let's say you work where that black dot is, and you've got a daughter or a son that has a recital or a soccer game or something out there at the edge of that circle. And you need to leave work early so that you can catch that soccer game or that recital. And now traffic congestion's gotten worse. And so when that recital starts, or that soccer game starts, you're not there. And when that game starts and that recital starts, and they look out in the audience or look on the sidelines of the soccer field, like I say, you're not there. Not because of anything you did, not because of anything they did, but because we let traffic congestion deteriorate over time because we didn't make the necessary investments. These things have real-world consequences. We often talk, and we do, because the problems are big, and Texas is the 10th, 11th, 12th largest economy in the world. The numbers are real big. But ultimately, these numbers translate down into things that mean something to people. Whether we're talking in terms of the business community and large employers, whether we're talking about small employers, or whether we're just talking about us as parents. They ultimately make a difference. And how we fund these needs over the course of the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years determines not only the quality of our economic life, but also impinges upon the quality of our personal life as well. And one of the things that we've seen is that we're not likely to have enough public funds in order to address this question. It's unlikely to be the case. So we're looking at a lot of other alternatives, and there are a lot out there. How we deal with them will dictate a lot about our quality of life. So what do we do next? Well, do we increase the fuel tax? Not really any lines forming to do that I can see. And index the fuel tax. There's been some talk about that. Increase registration fees. You heard Representative Darby talk about that. More toll roads. That's certainly a possibility. Public-private partnerships. That's a possibility as well. More of those. Comprehensive development agreements. A VMT fee. That's maybe something in the future. Who knows? Local transportation taxes on a local option basis. Maybe so. More debt finance. We've talked a lot about that today. Stopping diversions from the highway fund. Do we drive less, or do we move somewhere else? Well, there's a lot of things I'm willing to talk about. The only one I'm not of those is moving somewhere else. I'm not willing to do that, which means, and I think most Texans feel that way, which means we've got to deal with these issues somehow. And we've got a panel finally ready to go, and you can quit listening to me and listen to people who are much smarter than I. But that does set up the topic of this conversation, which is how we finance the needs that we have in this state, the needs that have been generated by the fact that we live in one of the great states in the country that has had a dynamic economic engine that has powered this economy and attracted people to this state. But how we deal with that will dictate the future for the state of Texas. And we are very, very blessed to have a panel here this afternoon to impart some of their wisdom and experience on this particular topic. And the first person I'm going to bring out is Walt Heumann. Now, Walt Heumann, you know, a lot of us would like to have one successful career. Walt Heumann has had several. Just to give you an idea, and I could spend the rest of the time talking about all the things that Walt Heumann has done, but just to give you an idea, Chairman and CEO of WJH Corporation, Chairman of the Executive Committee of Hunt Consolidated, Chairman of Memorex Telex, President, Commercial Groups, LTV Corporation, and that's just on the private side. In terms of his public service, around Dallas, Fort Worth area, he's known as the father of DART. Chaired and founded the Transportation Task Force, which helped create DART. He chaired and founded the North Central Texas Task Force, which deals with the highway and transit project in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He is a member of the Transportation Hall of Fame. He was selected a statewide Road Hand Award, which is the highest award you can receive from TxDOT, and he was also a recipient of a national award from the Secretary of Transportation for his public service. So we're glad to have Walt Heumann here on the panel. Also joining us will be Nicholas Rubio. Mr. Rubio is president of Centra US. Now, Centra US is the American arm of Centra, multinational corporation. He is a global leader in transportation infrastructure development, and he is Centra, by the way, has been a majority shareholder in toll roads in the U.S. worth over $11 billion, leads the Centra operations from right here in Austin, Texas, and he's got more than 2 decades of international executive leadership experience within the transportation and construction sectors. And he's been involved in the development of more than 150 private infrastructure projects spanning more than 30 countries. Next, we've got Paul Jack. He's managing director of Estrada Hinojosa and Company, and he's got over 17 years of experience in the structuring and issuance of debt obligations for political entities here in Texas and across the country, while serving in various capacities, either as a financial advisor or an underwriter. Mr. Jack has managed or supported the bond issuance process for over $20 billion in debt obligations. Prior to that, he worked for J.P. Morgan Company in the financial management group and at Citigroup as well. And he's done a great deal of work in Texas, all the way from the Harris County Toll Road Authority, Harris County Metropolitan Transit Authority, the North Texas Tollway Authority, so on and so forth, throughout the state of Texas. Our next panelist will be Evan Levine. He is around, I think. Yes, there he is. He's got 10 years experience in investment banking and transportation finance, specializing in structuring toll road and innovative financing. And he served TxDOT many times in its state highway fund revenue bond program and the North Texas Tollway Authority on the SH 121 and 161 financings. And he's nationally served as a senior manager for a diverse group of clients, including the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission, the Virginia Department of Transportation, and the Maryland Transportation Authority. And last, but certainly not least, is Gary Maychak. And Gary is Executive Vice President and Manager of the George K. Bauman Company, the Texas Public Finance Group. He's got 31 years of experience in public finance and banking and municipal advisory experience, and he brings a wealth of experience to this particular endeavor. He structured, marketed, senior managed, and provided financial advisory services for the full spectrum of public finance issuers, including schools, state agencies, counties, cities, special districts, hospitals, you name it. He's been responsible for about over $120 billion in short-term and long-term financings, publicly sold and privately placed here in Texas. And he served as a board member and a chairman of the Municipal Advisory Council of Texas. So that is our distinguished panel. Please join me in welcoming them up here. And gentlemen, if I can, I'd like to start out the discussion with just kind of a general question, if you will, and that is, we're focusing not exclusively in this particular conversation, but because of the wealth of experience we have up here, on P3 developments. We've heard talk a lot about it, a lot of different financing strategies here in Texas, but what is what's the right place for the state of Texas to be in terms of P3 versus pay-as-you-go, that sort of thing? Where should we be? What's the appropriate mix? Anybody want to take that on? Walt, go ahead.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations to you for your public service. Yesterday, I drove down from Dallas, Texas to Austin. I drove about 55 miles per hour. According to a recent report from TxDOT, 20 years from now, I will be driving at 15 miles an hour. We have a car for every man, woman, and child in the Dallas community. Congestion is terrible, and it's going to get worse unless we do something about it. To answer your question, I think we should stop kicking the can down the road. We need to address in this session now a $4 billion per year requirement on TxDOT to bring it from a mediocre agency in terms of funding to one of the preeminent ones that it used to be in the United States. How do we do that? Gasoline tax, we haven't raised it 1 cent over the last 20 years. That's split 75% for transportation, 25% for education. Not 1 cent. We don't use any more gasoline today than we did 10 years ago because of fuel efficiency. And so TxDOT is squeezed. We're starving it to death because it lacks funding. Do something with that sales tax now, with that gas tax. Number 2, registration fee, raise it. We'll never notice it, as was mentioned by a previous speaker. Certainly the rainy day fund, tap it if you've got the funds, but that's a one-time situation. We have an ongoing $4 billion a year hickey that we have got to face. What about diversion? Diversion can help. It's not going to be the panacea, and the people that you pull the funds to stop diverting are not going to sit quietly and ask for, say that's fine, we'll give up our revenue so someone else can have it. Debt, I don't believe in debt as a conservative businessman in the context of TxDOT. A couple of figures. In the year 2000, TxDOT owed almost $0. 2005, TxDOT borrowed $500 million. 2010, up to $10 billion, and now it's $13 billion. And in North Texas, Turnpike Authority, we're up to $13 billion. We are over leveraging, and I was sorry to hear the comment made today. He thinks this session is going to come up with another great financing technique, borrow more money, kick the can down the road. We need new revenue. And the final point I would say is that in terms of waste, TxDOT is one of the best, most professionally driven organizations that I've ever come in contact with. Have you ever heard TxDOT building a road and some of the people saying, oh, they screwed up, no one's using the road? There isn't waste. We've got to step up to the plate, and by we, I mean the general public and we in the business community. We cannot be two-faced and say we want no taxes and at the same time pound the table that we need $4 billion in revenue. So I'll say in a few minutes, we need to raise taxes and we need to raise fees. Thank you.
What about else? Anybody else in terms of the both the private sector involvement in P3s and the partnership between the private side and the public side in the development of transportation infrastructure? What is the role there for that partnership, and how has it evolved here in Texas and in the United States?
Let me make
Sure,
maybe a statement
absolutely,
there.
Mr. Rubio.
I think if you take a look at Texas today, there are the most remarkable P3 projects in the U.S. are located here in Texas. We have the privilege of being involved in 4 investment here. We are building up to $6 billion worth of highways using less than $1 billion public funds, state dollars. And That is more or less 15% of what the governor mentioned today, the 40 billion for the coming 20 years of additional funding. So I think that's very important. Now, having said that, at the same time, that has not been an easy path. I've been living in Texas now for 5 years, and I've been around for 10. And I had to learn what the two-step was as soon as I came here. And I understand now that it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. And that's somehow what we see. We believe there are still many, many opportunities. The state could be using this as just one more tool in the toolbox. Again, very remarkable projects going on, but probably more things could be done in this respect.
Let me ask, we've got 3 representatives here, if you will, from who do a lot of financing of public debt for infrastructure. We have been, in many ways, blessed in the United States here for the last few years with what is essentially historically low interest rates. What has that enabled? What's the risk down the road of increases in interest rates? How vulnerable does that leave cities, counties, special districts, et cetera, to being able to fund the projects that they need? Where are we in terms of the credit climate that exists? Not so much for the state, let's set that aside for a second and talk about the tremendous work that has to be done at the city and county level in Texas. Gary?
Sure. Thank you, David, and appreciate your comments in the beginning. They were very inspiring. And just let me talk a little bit about credit first, because I think the picture in Texas is a lot different than the United States. And I have a credit report of about a month and a half ago, and this is from one of the credit ratings. I just want to read what the headline is. It's U.S. public transportation sector can expect a bumpy road and a bit of turbulence in 2013. Another one, fiscal cliff would stress U.S. transportation infrastructure. Resiliency will be tested and ratings may be pressured. I think you see that across the United States in certain areas, but in Texas, I think what you see is that, and I think what you heard today was people stepping up and taking responsibility to fund this in a number of different ways, from the revenue side, from the debt side, the private side. So we've got a lot of innovative solutions out there. When you look at the credit strata for public issuers of transportation debt, 50% of them are at the A level. That's a pretty big percentage when you look at municipal credits. Right now, there's a large credit spread historically between AAA, AA, and single A credits. So those that are issuing with those types of credit ratings will have higher interest rates. And we know that interest rates have been low for a long time, and there's a lot of expectation there for increase. So we could see that. But that being said, absolute rates we're seeing sound very attractive in the tax-exempt market, well below 4% on the long end, and trailing all the way into the tenths of a percent on the short end. The one sort of thorn in the side on that is and this has come up very, very frequently recently. That is to cap the value of the tax-exempt return to investors on tax-exempt bonds that are used for most of the finance of this. This would increase the interest rates. So, that's
Anybody else?
Well, I'd probably just add to that as it relates to kind of the low interest rate environment and transportation infrastructure finance. I think it's created a window which it probably has benefits and some concerns from the standpoint of, to kind of tie into some of the earlier points. Texas is pretty much on the front line out of necessity of addressing infrastructure finance and adding to the asset base, and so as the policy and the public discourse continues on how we're going to actually generate revenues or funding to add all the, the large capital needs that are needed, is there are the other tools in the toolbox, which one of the main ones is toll roads and a new user fee structure. And when you look at toll road revenue finance as basically borrowing money supported by the tolls paid on a to-be-built toll road, you have a situation where in today's low interest rate environment, some of those projects aren't actually feasible, whereas maybe 10 years ago in a higher interest rate environment they weren't. So we have a window of opportunity where we can actually start trying to move some of those projects forward, and we can accelerate projects in today's market. But when the interest rates go up and that window shuts down and we see a rise in interest rates and then those projects become less feasible, it's going to bring back to the front again this whole issue of where are we going to come up with all the resources needed to address the funding needs. So to a certain degree, it might create a bridge of an opportunity where the pressure on new revenues, which people are trying to talk about and raise up and get people to really focus on, that's kind of the downside, but it eventually will come to, a point where there'll be a high pressure again.
Evan, is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what's been said. I wanted to go back to really 2 points that were made, and one is from a debt perspective and from a TxDOT perspective. TxDOT is the highest rated DOT in the country. They are far and away, I think, probably the most sophisticated, most professional organization in the country, right? They are AAA rated, even with the amount of debt that they've issued in the last 5 years for the state's needs, and they've done it the right way. And I also think, though, when I'm not sure that the private debt versus public debt is the most appropriate way to look at it. I think, right, whether Cintra is entering into a CDA with TxDOT to build a project, or TxDOT is, developing the Central Texas toll system here in Austin, right? Tolls are the repayment source. There has to be some source of money to pay the revenue, to pay the investor back. And whether a public sector approach or a private sector approach is the best approach for a certain project, I think is something that TxDOT is constantly evaluating. Each and every project that comes along its way. But it all comes back to you need revenue to, whether you're paying a tax-exempt debt investor or you're paying a concessionaire and a private investor, it always comes back to the revenue issue. And I think to Walt's point is that if we've heard a lot today about toll roads and perhaps people wanting to invest more money in non-tolled facilities, and I think it's inherently true that if the legislature and politicians across the country, this isn't a Texas issue, but it's a national issue, have been honest with the citizenry and said, these taxes and fees that are dedicated to transportation are going back into your road network, back into your infrastructure, and creating all the economic development and the ability to move goods and services both within your state and out of your state. I think that if all of those decisions had been made, we would have fewer toll roads here in Texas, because some of these roads that ended up being toll roads would have been built, with just TxDOT's ongoing PAYGO funds.
Well, you raised an interesting point, and I wanted to go back to Walt, if I could, for just a second on this. As I mentioned in your introduction, you have been involved in so many significant infrastructure projects in Dallas-Fort Worth area, and involving multiple layers of government, if you will, on a regional scale. And Evan just mentioned engaging the citizenry. I mean, how did you do that? How important was that in the process in terms of the success of that? How did you approach it? How did you build these coalitions? It's a little bit off topic, if you will, away from finance, but it's not to the extent that it's critical to people supporting these projects, however they get funded.
There are two areas for public transportation. You've got to create an enemy during a campaign, and the enemy is congestion, the economy. The central city of Dallas was dying because you couldn't get people to and from the suburbs. And so what I fear is that politicians think that voters are dumb. They're not. If you give them the facts, they really make very good, intelligent decisions. When we passed the DART election in 1983, that was the wave that was coming in from California on Prop 13. Roll back taxes. Taxes are a bad thing. As recently as last year, 72% of the people that we polled said we would agree to increase our sales tax 1% in cities like Arlington, Texas, which has no public transportation system. We'll agree to that because what we're going to get is something of substance. You can't finance a transportation system, especially a public transportation system, if it's undercapitalized. We have that problem in business. And that's why DART in Dallas, Houston, and Austin all went to the limit, and they passed a 1% sales tax. The other cities, I would urge them to come up to a full 1%, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to hit the operating expenses, where that agency only covers about 15% of the operating costs at fairs. The rest has to come from that sales tax. And certainly you have no credibility when you go to Washington if you want large project dollars if you're not bringing money to the table. On Central Expressway, that was the oldest living highway controversy in the United States, according to the Secretary of Transportation. And we would keep fussing back and forth, but no decision, sort of like we are in finance now. And so the enemy that I created there was the following. We were killing 3 to 30 people a year on a freeway that was the most congested in the state of Texas and the third most dangerous in the nation. In addition, all of the property owners along Central were begging. This is one of the most viable corridors in North Texas. Please, we've got to do something. The state was here, the local people were here, and the city government. What you do is you get them all in the same room. First, policymakers. I talked to the governor, the head of the Highway Commission, and the 4 mayors, and I said, if I call you on the phone, please take my call so we can undo policy tangles. Second, the technical people, TxDOT, local people, and a neutral third party, Griner Engineering. Want you all in the same room. Ideally, I'd like to lock the door, and you all come up with the viable solution. We looked at 128 alternatives, narrowed it down to one single consensus solution that you see now in Dallas, Texas. And I never called for a single vote, because in a vote, you have winners and losers. And I wanted to make sure that everyone felt like they were winners. And the last is the community at large, the AAA, the neighborhood associations, the people that were disadvantaged, all need a role at that table. And so we were fortunate that we developed a coalition and we passed DART and we got Central Expressway. And I just feel so frustrated because, as the gentleman earlier said, the solutions are right there for us. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that we need new revenue if we're going to be a viable state. But don't think small. We're Texans. Think bold. And let's really act like it.
If we do that, if we begin to get new revenue streams on the public side, even if that occurs, and there may be progress being made in the legislature based on some of the things that were said today, but there's still, is there a role for the private sector in transportation development in particular? And that's to me is a fundamental question, and I wanted to ask Mr. Rubio in particular. You know, the U.S. in terms of P3s, in terms of equity investment on the part of the private sector in transportation improvements, has not had the robust history that there's been in other parts of the world. And I wanted to get you to talk about that a little bit, because you've got a breadth of international experience. Has that been because of, is it legal impediments in the United States? Is it Is it public opinion? Has it just been lack of need? What's been the reason for that? And how has that climate changed over the course of the last few years?
Yeah, I think it's much more linked to tradition and the sickness of being living in a rich environment. The interstate bill was passed in 1956. There has been a flow of dollars into the transportation system that has been consistently more than enough, not only to build, but to maintain all that big network of the interstates. And as we heard today, it is in the last years that the dollars coming from the gas tax are being unable to cope with the expansion of the infrastructure and maintaining existing infrastructure. So that brings, that forces all of us to think on new ways of funding. It is interesting what you say, because I attend conferences and I hear people speaking, and what you normally find is everyone focusing on funding. Where can we raise additional funds? Do we look at the gas tax or the vehicle registration fee? Well, there are two sides of developing infrastructure. One of them certainly is funding. The other one is the cost of developing the infrastructure. Are we using the more efficient approach to really solve the congestion problem, to doing more with less dollars? And that's the other big advantage that the private sector brings to the table. It's not going to be the only industry. Well, bringing the private sector to come with ideas, with holistic approach, is going to reduce the final cost of what you are doing. It's not only about funding, but also about cost. There are studies out there. Privatization brings savings in transportation industry anywhere between 15 and 25%. There have been very thorough analysis. There's one analysis by the University of Melbourne of 2007 on 54 different projects, comparing P3 approach and traditional design bid build approach, and it resulted that the P3 approach was achieving 15% less cost deviation and completing the projects 25% ahead of time. So those are the other elements that the private sector can bring to the table. And why have not been there in the past? Well, probably because there were many fuel tax dollars.
Anybody else care to comment on that, particularly with respect to the financing end of things and the differences here between here in the United States and other parts of the world that have perhaps inhibited the development of private infrastructure? Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were...
Oh, this is a conversation. Jump in anytime you want.
No, I think that one of the... I think there are three points. I think one is that the United States does have this tax-exempt market that doesn't exist in the rest of the world. And it is the traditional way that the United States, whether it's cities, counties, DOTs, toll authorities, have funded their infrastructure. And given today's historically low rates, and they've been historically low really since the P3 has come to the United States in 2004 and 5, right? Rates, everyone's always been talking about, oh, rates are going to go up, but as rates have continued lower, that has always remained an attractive and known quantity, I think, to many people. I think one of the other things has been, and has nothing to do with public or private, has just been the tolls. Tolls here in Texas have gained traction. I think tolls, I'm from New York. I grew up with tolls. I assumed everybody paid tolls growing up, and that's just not true. But, tolls have proved controversial in certain parts of the country, particularly for new infrastructure. And therefore it creates this sort of tension between the private sector. And this goes back to what I said before, is that Cintra's in the business of making money, and they have to get paid. And that's the same thing with a public toll authority, slightly different focus. But whether it's an availability payment that's coming from TxDOT or whoever the sponsor's funds are, or the toll payer, right? The toll payer, all they want is to pay the lower toll, right? And there are certain projects, there are lots of reasons why the private sector makes a lot of sense on a lot of projects, whether it's just on a design-build basis or on a design-build, finance, operate and maintain, like many of the projects here in Texas. So I think it's part of it is the known versus the unknown. I think part of it has been, and I've seen it and it's been unfortunate, but if you take even Pennsylvania Turnpike, and I worked on sort of the public side of that, but there's been, I think, resistance to the idea of non-U.S. citizens owning or non-U.S. companies owning American infrastructure, particularly some of our older legacy assets like the Pennsylvania Turnpike or the Ohio Turnpike that have gone through concession analysis. And I'd be interested to hear your opinion on how you've been able to respond to it in public settings. Because, I watch it as an observer and so forth, but I don't think there's one reason why the public versus private has gone one way. I think each project is different, each constituency is different, but at the end of the day, it also comes down to there has to be a revenue source to pay, because nobody has been willing to raise the type of money anywhere in this country, to do it on a pay-as-you-go basis, right? Nobody has excess funds sitting around where they can build a 20-mile managed lane project, the cost with bridge work and like the LBJ project or SH 130 up segments 5 and 6, right? There's just not the money sitting around, and so the issue is how do what revenue source repays the debt, repays the equity provider? And normally that's been tolls, which create its own, source of controversy.
I wanted to, well, first of all, Gary, you were jotting down feverishly there. I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment.
Thanks, Dave. And this is just on a small portion of the public debt side. I think we've got a lot going in our favor. As we've talked about, the great credit of the state of Texas and the agencies and its local issuers, the low interest rate environment that we still have, and as I think we've heard today, a willingness to deal with the funding side, with a lot of different ideas of how to do that. Not that I want to pick on these two sort of institutions out there, but there are these sort of things that can bubble up. And one of them is with the rating agencies, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. And we've seen this in other sectors, and I think it's probably happened in transportation too. Given what they've gone through over the last few years with some probably congressional oversight that has occurred, they continue, as to quote one of my colleagues, continue to move the goalposts right in the middle of when we're trying to finance this. So they may have a set of criteria that they've had in place for many, many years, but now they'll change it. And then the second one that I wanted to mention is the source of federal funding and the uncertainty of that. The 11th hour fixes that occur, the sequester, all leads to a big portion of the funding source that leads to a lot of uncertainty. But again, to balance that, I think what you see here is you have the will to look at the local solving these problems on a local level.
To speak to one more question on debt financing, if you will. So the Federal Open Market Committee meets their next meeting here next month, or maybe it's the following meeting, but at some point, sometime, they start to raise interest rates, kind of getting back to this again in the climate that we've been in for a while. And those interest rates start to climb. Does transportation get priced out of the market? How vulnerable is transportation as at some point in the future, whenever that may be, interest rates begin to rise? What's the risk there?
Well, let me just, I guess, to take
go
a
ahead,
first
Paul.
stab at that, I guess to take a step back again to also kind of be mindful of a number of the points that have been kind of raised here. you know, the concepts of toll roads and public-private partnerships, which people also put in the same category as toll roads, can raise a lot of emotional responses, both in favor and kind of against. And the reason we're spending a lot of time focusing on that to the broader concept is unless the public policy discourse gets to where we have new revenue streams, new funding mechanisms, this is the kind of the main path we have left to address infrastructure. So assuming no changes are made on how we're going to generate the funding of the new assets, we're going to be vulnerable to the interest rate markets and the perception of risk and the return on projects that are basically focused on generating revenue from the users in the form of tolls. And that puts us in a vulnerable situation, but it also is why we're so focused both on this panel and at various initiatives that are going on at legislatures on finding more tools, and these are buzzwords we use, more financial tools to pull in the toolbox for creating an opportunity to get to the access of borrowing money to finance toll roads. So whether it be, you know, innovative ways to address credit rating concerns, because interest rates and credit rating drive the feasibility of basically debt-financed projects that are off of revenues.
I wanted to get you to comment on that, Mr. Rubio, if I could, and get you to add whatever you wanted to add, but specifically comment on interest rate risk and how that goes into your calculations.
Yeah, I was going to jump on that because, yes, it is true that interest rates are extremely low now. But there is also, private investors look at P3s, at long-term revenue risk infrastructure concessions or rates as somehow protected from interest rate and inflation risk. There is a natural, there's a correlation between inflation and interest rate on the long term, so there's a natural protection for very long-term investors in these kind of deals because, yes, interest rates can go up, but normally on the long term, tolls would also go up and revenues would also go up. If you take a look, for instance, again, at the investments we are now managing here in Texas, the investors in these concessions, we have Hastings from Australia, a pension fund manager. We have APG investing in the Dallas and Fort Worth projects, APG being the largest European pension fund. John Hancock from Boston, the Dallas Police and Fire pension system. So there is a lot of liquidity out there in the market looking at this kind of long-term revenue stream investments as an opportunity. No? So maybe that could answer your question.
Absolutely. And we've got just about 10 or 12 minutes left, and so I'm going to do two more questions because the last one, I want each one of you to address a particular issue I'm going to ask. But before I do that, Representative Darby and the governor, for that matter, talked about the State Infrastructure Bank earlier today, and one of the and finding a way to capitalize that, but specifically to look at credit enhancements and how they can play a role in helping kickstart projects that might not otherwise, that probably would not get done. And so I want to ask Paul, if you could, to talk about this credit enhancement provision, first of all, what that exactly means and what the impact might be if a bill like that were to be enacted.
Sure, and that goes to kind of the point I was making in my earlier comments, in that since we are focused on how can we make more toll road projects viable, that's really kind of what this kind of credit enhancement program and programs like that are addressing, in that to leverage the limited funding that we can make available under the current funding mechanisms we have. You know, a credit enhancement program is basically a fund that would basically, you know, co-sign the debt issued by a toll road project financing. So if it's a startup toll road and there's concerns about its credit worthiness, this helps basically get investors over that concern and therefore allows that project to access, you know, funding for the project. And it also lowers the cost. So if you have, the ability to get credit enhancement and issue bonds that are highly rated, highly investment grade, you're going to lower your borrowing costs, and you're going to be able to get projects to the market that otherwise aren't viable, and it just starts to multiply. And the way that some of these programs are set up is you can get a multiple effect on the actual funds you set aside to create that enhancement. So you'll get a, a 3 times multiple in terms of capital for your money invested, and then you also get the return on actually having that investment put in place earlier rather than later.
So at its essence, it's basically more or less a credit backstop?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments on that before we move on to the last one?
I think the timeliness is perfect because we have seen the private side of this either dry up completely or rates for credit enhancement of some kind become astronomical. Now they have come down. Other banks have come in and are starting to offer it, but it's a welcome event. The other thing too, just with regards, I think we talked a little bit about the market access and if rates go up, what will happen. Again, the best way to ensure that we'll have marketability for these types of issues is to maintain our high credit standards. Institutions are the big buyers of this. I mean, for a bit we saw retail when we had during 2007, 2008, but for the most part the institutions have come back. But given a credit event, they will penalize you. And in this market, the penalties are pretty severe when you try to come back into the market if you've devalued the bonds that they already hold.
Well, the last question that I wanted to ask you, and again, I want to move down the panel. We'll start out with Gary here, and we'll end up with Walt down there on the end. But we've talked about a lot of different alternatives today in terms of financing, transportation, infrastructure improvements. We've talked about a lot about the problems, and we all come to look at this problem from a little bit different perspective, our own prism of personal experience or what we do for a living, that sort of thing. But one of the things that we all have in common is that we're all transportation consumers, if you will, and using the system. So if we all made you king for a day, Gary, how are you going to fix this mess? What would you do?
Well, if there's just two small things, I guess, and the one I mentioned already, if we can maintain and keep the fear of speculation that the tax-exempt value is going to somehow be capped or inhibited, I think we continually see that, and it causes a lot of concern. But also, I think to go back to what I felt was very inspiring on your part too, I think if as financial planners, engineers, everyone that's involved, economists, to go back and really think of the individual and what their needs are, and the freedom that they have, and to plan appropriately for transportation in that way, for the choices that they make. That is the the essence of I think what we can make a great system.
So focus on scaling it to people.
Yes.
As one thing, and then second, keep in mind some of the risk that is out there.
The risk that's out there with regards to the loss of tax exemption or a portion of tax exemption for the financing.
Evan?
I think I have 3 points, not of all of which are.
That's all right. You're king, so you can do whatever you want.
I think first the way in which we look at transportation funding in general is somewhat siloed, right? Motor fuel taxes go for roads, and regional sales taxes go for mass transit, and tolls are, in most places stay on the road, and but then you also hear from the ports people this morning about wishing they had money for dredging, and you have somebody talk about needing her focus right at the Port of Corpus Christi was sort of freight rail, and we look at all of these various different modes and silos. Mm-hmm. And I think the one thing I would love to see is sort of a more holistic view of transportation funding, in that it is all interconnected. It is all economic development. So I think that's number one. I think number two is just the way, and we talked about this all day, is just the way in which politics, transportation funding, because so much of our funding is dedicated funding. It really is, I think, when you talk to people, sort of a distinct form, distinct taxes, right? They can see the tangible benefit of a gas tax. What's so interesting to me is in Texas, gas taxes went up from 5 cents a gallon to 20 cents a gallon between 1977 and 1991, and then it's just stopped, right? And now that somebody mentioned earlier that the value of $1 today is 62 cents. $1991, 62 cents today. Meanwhile, the state has grown exponentially. And so I think that's sort of, totally lost my train of thought.
That's all right. What you're really focusing on there.
And I think the third one is for the federal government either to do something or get out of the way.
So basically the three issues there: leverage and synergy in terms of a comprehensive system, more revenues, and then some consistency, if you will, from the federal government.
Yes.
To be polite about it. And go ahead, Paul. What's your thought here?
Well, I'll somewhat dodge the question, but I'll answer it like this. It being king for the day, I think the main thing I would like to see, or I think would be useful for moving this along, is really at the public and policy level is really readdressing how we feel the transportation infrastructure should be equitably funded. Primarily it's gas tax and sales tax for mass transit. And gas tax was originally envisioned as a user fee. And the majority of the fleet had the same miles per gallon. And so it was basically a good measure of paying per consumption of the system. And now the system and where the system's going is, that's completely, kind of editorialized my opinion, really not an equitable way, because you have a high discrepancy in fuel efficiency in the vehicles on the roads, and you also have basically people using the roads in different ways, and you also have a lot more competing modes of transportation. And so in that fashion, I don't know what the answer is, but I think it basically says if you're wholly relying upon a motor fuel tax, which is a unit tax, not a percentage tax, and you look at the demographics of vehicle miles traveled in the US, it's basically flatlined. And so if you're trying to fund your entire network on a flatlined revenue source that is not really representative of the problem you're trying to address, you have a fundamental issue that has to be fixed.
So basically it comes down to similar in a way, and finding a consistent, reliable user fee that will fund the needs into the future. Nicholas? King for a day. What do we do?
I think, as we heard this morning, there's no silver bullet. I think there has to be a combination of things, but I would probably look at other industries. You take a look at the telecommunications industry. When I was a kid, I lived for 2 years in Houston, and I heard my parents afterwards saying that they were saving through the month to place an overseas call at the end of the month, so that they could talk to the family. For me, the most amazing thing of our cell phones today is not that we can walk around and talk, it's the cost of an international call with that phone. Nobody could imagine that some time ago. And in grand part, that is due to the privatization of the telecommunications industry. You get to a hotel, you open your browser, and you have several options. You want high speed, you pay more. You don't need that high speed, you pay less. I think bringing some of those ideas and principles to transportation and to road transportation would certainly be helpful.
All right, Walter, we're going to close it out with you.
Well, long term, this state, our people need to think of public transit as a viable long-term solution. We in the business community can do more to encourage our employees to carpool, vanpool, so we make more efficient use of the highway. But I want to come back to TxDOT and the problem that you've heard this morning, at noon, and right now. Just imagine there's $4 billion written on that screen up there. What are we going to do about $4 billion? And so, to make my final point, I wonder if you could participate with me. It's late in the afternoon. I want to bring a little levity on this thing. So, what I want us to do is reenact a movie scene from A Few Good Men. Now, in A Few Good Men, you'll recall that Jack Nicholson, that's me, is this tough, egotistical, arrogant Marine commandant of Gitmo. And he is as tough as nails, and two of his men were charged with murder. And they're going to be tried in Washington, D.C. And the Navy has appointed a lowly lieutenant to be the defender of those two men. Now, you are Tom Cruise. You are defending those two. So this, I want you to get in your role. Now, the next thing is, you had the arrogance to subpoena me from Gitmo to come all the way to Washington, D.C. to testify in the trial. So when I get there, I swear in, and then I proceed to tell you like it is. And he lectures Tom Cruise. At one point, though, to make his final point, he says, "Are we clear?" And what I want you to respond is very clear. Just two words you got to remember first. And then he comes back for emphasis and he says, "Are we absolutely clear?" And you are to reply with a robust voice, crystal clear. You got that? Very clear, crystal clear, and I'll give you the prompt. All right? Now, you've come here for answers. You don't want the answers. You want the truth. You don't want the truth. You don't believe that that $4 billion is serious up there, and you're not willing to do anything about it. And I'm telling you, we need to do something about it right now. We need to raise taxes. We need to increase our fees. We need to toll a whole bucket of things. And if we don't get some new revenue, we're going to regret it. So, my point is, don't sit and do nothing. I want you to think hard and long about raising taxes and meet that $4 billion per year now. Are we clear on that point?
Very clear.
Are we absolutely clear on that point?
Crystal clear.
Thank you, and you're dismissed.
Well, I know I can't top that, and so that's the end of this panel. Once again, thank these great panelists.